final session of the conference, we're going to be talking about Me Too to women's liberation, fighting sexism and the system. We're going to hear from Lucy Honan, who's a teacher, an Australian Education Union counsellor in Victoria, a founder of Teachers for Refugees, and a member of Solidarity. So Lucy is going to talk for about 15 minutes. And as this is the last session of the conference, you know the drill. At the end, we'll have contributions and questions and discussion from the floor. So we might get underway now with Lucy, and we'll check back in for contributions after Lucy's finished.
Okay, thanks, Ruby. I want to start off by just talking about how much of a nerve that Me Too 10 months ago struck. Especially in the earlier months last year, just October through to December, January, February even, there was a flood of participation all over the planet. And I think the hashtag and the sentiment of Me Too tapped a very deep anger about the way that women are treated as disposable sex objects at work, at home, on the streets, at universities. And I think this sentiment had been building up for a long time. Reviews like the report into campus sexual assault and harassment, the fact that Liberal and Labor are both being increasingly pushed to at least give lip service to the fact that they are doing something about violence against women or dealing with violence against women. These sorts of signs have been kind of around the place so often, but I think Me Too, more than anything, was if anybody needed evidence that John Howard's we're living in a post-feminist world where women under 30 are really over that kind of thing. Me Too was a very, very clear sign that we are so not over it, and that all those concerns about inequality, but particularly, of course, with Me Too about harassment and rape and sexual assault are absolutely there, and people are quite rightly furious about it. So there are hundreds of thousands of women in Australia, but as I said, all over the world, who are expressing their opposition to the sick attitudes in our society about sexuality and about sexism. And I think the other part of Me Too is that it was an expression that the problem is not an abstract one. It's not something that's out there in general, but it's something that is very, very intimate. And it's something that is a feature of our lives that affects us in the most intimate and personal ways. However, the months since the headlines, the Me Too headlines, the Harvey Weinstein, Don Burke, Craig McLachlan sort of blockbuster Me Too stars, I suppose, have kind of diminished. And instead of the kind of mass tweeting and Facebooking and so on, there's now it's translated into a handful of court trials. There's an inquiry into sexual harassment in Australia. For universities, there are online consent modules coming out. And there's still the enormous rage, but the sense, I certainly feel like that rage has not found its lever, that there is an enormous, that disgust and horror that so many women expressed has not found its expression in a sense of like, yes, this is the thing that we can do that's really going to change it. And I think that kind of partly explains the same phenomenon that occurred when Eurydice Dixon was raped and murdered a month or so ago. It was the same kind of enormous expression, online, social media, and so on, workplace conversations. Everybody, maybe I'm biased because I'm in Melbourne, but I do get the sense that there were a lot of people talking about it should not have happened to her and it shouldn't have happened to anybody. And this generalising sense of what is it in our society that keeps producing rape, that keeps producing over and over again, not just the horrific ones and not just the monstrous versions of sexual assault like what happened with Eurydice Dixon, but all of the different versions of that we experience all the time. Why does this keep happening? And implicit in the outrage, I think, is that there's this expectation that actually we deserve so much better than this, that we deserve not to be living in a society where we're treated as sex objects, but we deserve to be treated as fully fledged human beings, not just with equality with men, but in a sense that we should be free to express our sexuality however it is that we want to. So as I was saying, I mean, I think that the rage is there, but insofar as there is a focus, I think that the Me Too phenomenon has found the wrong focus. In identifying, I think there are a lot of people who are talking about, we need to talk about the system, that there is a system behind the sexism and so on. But feminists, politicians, the Me Too celebrities and the left in general, I've found that when talking about a sexist system, what they're usually referring to is a sexist culture and behaviour and attitudes, and particularly sexist culture and behaviour and attitudes that men are perpetuating, and this idea that it is a masculinist culture of some kind, a male culture, that is the system that's behind sexual violence. So we have people like Clementine Ford, who wrote after Eurydice Dixon's rape and murder, "I'm increasingly disagreeing with the view that not all men are part of the problem, and it's because that I truly think that most of them don't understand that the problem is theirs to solve." Just one example, Tracy Spicer, who's another ex-journalist, current journalist, set up the National Organisation for Women, which is focused around exposing perpetrators of sexual assault, but also prosecuting male perpetrators. And the feminists are actually in lockstep at the moment in a strange way with the Liberal and the Labor and the Greens politicians who are universally calling for education programs. So Rob Stokes here. The Andrews government already has a very elaborated education program. Turnbull's talking about the importance of educating the youngest boys so that they are not part of this problem of sexual assault in the future. They're in furious agreement with each other that there is a culture that needs deconstructing. There's an extent to which I think it's understandable that this becomes a common sense. I disagree with it, and I think there isn't enough evidence. In fact, there is a lot of evidence to say it's wrong. But I think there's an understandable reason why people feel like, yes, this is the explanation, this is the system that we're trying to talk about. 97% of perpetrators of violence against women are men. There is a high correlation between men who sexually assault women and their sexist beliefs. The fact that sexism infects our most intimate relationships and our most intimate partnerships, I think, and that sense that I was talking about before, that it's not just the monsters, that it's actually that it's everywhere, that men around us are perpetrators in some way of this. I think there are examples. If people want to find them, they will find examples. Definitely they aren't slim pickings in that regard, of men who have been abusive and sexist towards women. But I think it also seems as though, and this is, again, I disagree with this, but I think there is an apparent surface level appearance that sexism and harassment operates on a separate axis than class and other oppressions. So, for example, Trump and Weinstein are two, ruling class figures of violence against women. It's clear that they are doing that all the time from the very top of society. But then on the other end of the spectrum, the men who raped and murdered Eurydice Dixon, James Todd, is from Broadmeadows. He's definitely not a ruling class figure, and you can find, again, every time you want to find somebody who, a man who is a perpetrator of sexual assault on the spectrum of class, you can find it. And again, it seems like there's a sense in which across political perspectives as well. I've actually just read Rose McGowan's book Brave, which I don't know if anybody has read it, but there are just so many very strange examples, and I'm holding myself back from quoting from it all the time. But there's this one really, really interesting anecdote right at the end of the book. Rose McGowan is one of the women who kicked off the allegations against Harvey Weinstein, and in part of her, determination to end sexual assault and violence against women, she goes to the Writers Guild, the union that represents writers for Hollywood, and she says to the union guy there, the head of the union, I want to talk to the writers, like peer to peer, about you people have to stop writing these really sexist roles. And the head of the union says, I don't know, I'll have to ask my women's committee about it, and just bats her off. And in Rose McGowan's book, she goes into, a bit of a tirade about, male liberals, for example, this guy who, seem to be blocking the way to action on to stop violence against women. So those are the examples that I think, there is enough evidence to say, or to feel as though there is this just a general masculinist culture. But at the same time, I think given any amount of reflection, most of us can also instinctively realise that the idea of a male culture oppressing women just doesn't add up as an explanation. We all know men who don't want to do that, who don't want to associate themselves with rape, and who will do anything that they possibly can, get themselves into all kinds of Facebook debates or call-outs or whatever it is in order to distance themselves from sexism. We also know that there are plenty of women who benefit from, sexist ideas, like the Julie Bishops, the Ivanka Trumps, any number of those examples. And we know as well, and many women in the room will know that even when you are surrounding yourselves with, so many woke men and so many great women, you can still feel the corrosive impact of sexism in your life. It doesn't, take an experience of sexual assault to feel like a very small person in a room. And that is that feeling that sexism has left all women in our society with, to different degrees. So there's even though there's the surface appearance, I think there's also a lot of holes in the narrative that leave people a bit like, well, where do we go? Where does our anger find its resonance? How do we make a change? So I want to move on to talk about a Marxist approach and a Marxist analysis of women's oppression that does get us a bit closer to an answer about what is the heart of the problem, what is a better explanation of the structures or the system that's underlying sexism, and therefore what can we do about it. So for Marxists, structures are not about culture, and it's not that sexism is just an idea, although obviously we recognise that there are plenty of sexist ideas and plenty of people propping up sexist ideas in our society. But those ideas about women's inferiority and their sexual objectification and so on, endorse and justify a social order that's much more fundamental and much more rooted in capitalism. And at the heart of that is the nuclear family. There's nothing timeless or natural about organising our families into heterosexual units, monogamous private bodies where the work of reproducing and raising children and feeding and washing and caring for everyone is essentially the private, unpaid, unvalued labour of women. There is nothing normal about that, and yet in our society that is how everybody is forced to organise their lives. And this isn't because, again, it's not because of ideas that people in Australia or any country organise themselves like this. There's a really interesting study, the Hilda surveys, which happen every year into household labour dynamics. And this year they interviewed couples and asked about whether or not they hold traditional values, and tried to figure out how much people adhere to those ideas that men should be out working and women should be in the kitchen and raising children and so on. And it's relatively low. People don't want to organise their lives in that way. And yet, when the same survey looks at how households are organised, couples, heterosexual couples, share labour, the total labour of running a house, including paid work and household labour, housework and childcare. They share it 50-50, straight down the middle most of the time. But women end up doing the work that is unpaid. They do the childcare, they do the housework and so on, and men are more likely to do more of the paid work. And again, it's not because of their ideas. It's pretty obvious that in a society where men are paid more than women, it makes financial sense for both the man and the woman for the man to be the one working and bringing in the money that's going to be, a higher wage, and for women to take the time off and do the childcare and in some circumstances do more of the housework. So in this situation, we've got structured into the very thing that raises us all, that, is the heart of how we are all born and raised in this society, is a fundamental inequality and a situation where women are doing this work that is is fundamentally undervalued, unpaid. It's essentially the slave labour of capitalism is to bring up children in this way, and to reproduce ourselves in this way. And those ideas then that are reflected in society and reflected back on us about that this is normal and we should appreciate it, and it's actually a really lovely way to live your life, and how glorious for men to find a wife that's going to do this for them, and how wonderful for women to, have that big day and look forward to that moment where they can settle down. All of those ideas that Harvey Weinstein and people like that are pumping out every day. That's reflecting back to us something that's already fundamentally structured into our economy, into the way that we've organised our lives. So it explains to a large extent why women are undervalued. It explains to a large extent why men, for example, are very violent. Well, there's why violence against women happens so frequently in the home, because when all the pressures of capitalism, when unemployment or underpayment or whatever the brutalities of capitalism and alienation exert on people, the person who is supposed to make that better in a completely unpaid way is supposed to be the woman of the family, who's supposed to support people, feed, nurture, be the buffer of capitalism. And when that doesn't work, then it is really unsurprising, actually, that the violence against women occurs and breaks along that structure of inequality in families. And also, similarly, if you've got women being treated like objects like this in our system, why men feel like they, that they are entitled to steal sex. So, for example, I'll come back to the point about James Todd later, but I think you get the point that the structure of inequality is more fundamental than just ideas. So I guess I'll move on to So if you understand that the structural nature of it, then that points towards the demands that loosen the nuclear family, that make the pressures of the family weaker, and that undermine all of those elements and instruments of sexism. So for example, childcare, abortion rights, maternity leave. Things like disability support for families. These are things that are concretely loosening the pressure of women, and all of those expectations that women are supposed to absorb in the family are made social, and that's why those are the kinds of demands that are so important for laying serious blows against sexism in the system. I just wanted to deal with a couple of things, because I think a lot of the arguments that I've seen around the place are that, maybe you have a structural analysis like that about sexism, but can't you also deal with attitudes and men's behaviour as a way to kind of step into that space and start dealing with the deeper structural stuff, but at least calling men out or calling out bad behaviour kind of gets you on the track of dealing with sexism. And I have now had an awful lot of experience of education programs and behaviour change programs at work. So I'm a high school teacher, and we are supposed to now run these respectful relationships programs in Victoria, and I can say pretty unequivocally how badly they operate. They do not work at all, and I don't think it's just my teaching in this instance. The way I'll give you an example. So there's one subject that's, for example, about consent and encouraging people to kids to think about women and each other as having the right to wear whatever they like, go wherever they like, say no to things that they don't want happening to them, and to walk away from situations that they don't like. And I'm supposed to teach this in a classroom where kids are not wearing what they like in any stretch of the word. They're not allowed to go anywhere where they like. I tell them where they're going. They're not allowed to talk back to me. They're not allowed to, the rules about their lives and the autonomy that they exercise over their lives for boys and girls is just ridiculous. And the sense in which, the kids just look back at you with this, like, are you serious? I'm not going to take you seriously. You're trying to tell me that I have these rights, or that I'm supposed to give these rights to somebody else, when you're not giving me, you as the face of, the system, are not giving me these rights. It just gets thrown back in your face over and over again as kind of like, nah, stuff you. The thing, I don't think that education in a general, I'm a teacher, so I generally, and I'm here talking to people, I think talking about the system and educating kids about, where the heart of the problem is, and encouraging them to direct their rage at, the sexist uniform policy, for example, or, their teachers' underpayment, or, their parents' lack of access to childcare and things like this. I think those sorts of things are educative and useful, and therefore provide a useful context for talking about different things and the way that they're treating each other and so on. But unless you start with that context of there is a real problem that is the system, you end up talking about kids and identifying them as the perpetrators or the proto-perpetrators of sexual assault. And that is, quite rightly, I think, thrown back in your face as a just like, that's not on. And I think that's true not just in consent workshops, but in general. Like, if we see each other, working class men and other working class women as the problem, then we are not actually starting that conversation or starting to look at what the deeper issue is here, what it is that our society is formed around. We're having a debate with each other about behaviour, and that doesn't get us anywhere. How much? Oh, I'm at 20 minutes, sorry. I thought I didn't have enough. Okay. Yeah, okay. I'll just end on the note about just identifying that lever. So if we do see those structural demands as levers, then I think, and the system as fundamentally needing to change in order to get real liberation for women, then I think we do need to see men as working class men, that is, as people who have a common interest in that fight, not as enemies, but as people who are integral to fighting back against that system and transforming it. And I think, apart from the fact that they have a common interest in that, men have a common interest in childcare being free and totally accessible, and non-privatised disability services and school support programs and all of these, abortion rights, etc., etc. Men absolutely, working class men's lives would be absolutely relieved by all of those different things. But also, I think we need to see, and working class women as well, need to see that when men are fighting back against the system, that's useful for us too. When the CFMEU goes on strike, even if it's not on strike, about women's rights or about childcare or anything like that, that's the ruling class that's holding us back as well. And there is an opportunity there, in all of those class fightbacks to talk about our common struggle and to generalise and to build connections about what it is, why we need to fight, the exploitation in general in the system, but in particular those things that are holding women in a particularly oppressed situation. And I think there are a lot of opportunities that we can do that in. There's no dearth of opportunities for that. So I'll leave it there.